We're in Lightroom, the develop mode of Lightroom, and I wanted to just show you how to use some of the tools. This is Lightroom 4. So we have a new interface compared to the earlier versions of Lightroom. So let's go through some of these things. First, let's look at an image and sort of decide what we need to do. Well, we have an image a little bit crooked, a little bit washed out in terms of the color. Exposure's not bad. Color balance, not bad. So let's see if we can touch it up just a little bit. So I'm going to go in up here to the crop mode and turn on the crop. And you see the image has already been sort of pre-cropped. I batch pre-cropped these as I brought them in. And what I need to do here is correct for a little bit of a tilt in my image. So I click on the angle tool, and I'm just going to drag from there to there. All right. And what I'm doing is defining a line that should be a vertical line. Now, having done that, I need to bring my crop in a little bit. I'm just going to touch that up a bit and bring it on the side. Okay, then I click on the Done button down here, and there we have a little bit straighter than I think it was to start with. In the develop mode, by the way, we should point out that over here on the left side we do have a history panel that shows us all the things that we've done. I can go back to where I imported it, where I updated to the current process. That's from the earlier version to the 2012 Adobe engine, color engine. I did run a preset which corrects for distortion with the camera that this was shot with, which was my Konica Minolta A200, and it also applies a little bit of noise reduction, a little bit of sharpening, and a very slight tone curve to the image to increase the blacks just a little bit. Okay, and you can see that's what that did. And then we just looked at the crops that we were doing and the changing of the cropping dimensions. Okay, so that's where we stand at the moment. Alright, so now let's come up. Let's look at white balance. Do we want to correct the white balance? One of the nice things about this is you can go up over here in the basic panel over on the right side, and if we click on the white balance selector and drag it into our image, you see wherever I drag it over the image, I get a preview. If you look over in the navigator window on the top left, you can see as I move this around that it's showing me a preview of what the white balance is going to look like. Now in this particular case you say, well, what should be white? Well, the cloud probably should be pretty close to white, and we're not burning out any highlights, so that should be pretty close. But you can see in the preview that looks to me like it adds a little bit too much green to the image. If I come down and pick the top of the building, which is presumably white, alright, we're still getting a little bit colder color than I'm looking at here. But let me just click, apply that white balance correction. Do we like that? Do we not like it? I don't particularly like that one. So I'm going to go over to the history list and back up one step. The other place where we might have something that's not necessarily white, but something that should be not have a color cast would be the pavement here. And pavement here does have a little bit of a yellow input to it. Over here it's darker. There might be a little bit of yellow. But if we click on it there, okay. That helped a little bit. It didn't go quite as far in terms of shifting the white balance as we got by clicking up on the roof of the building or in the clouds itself. Now you can see the color correction that it applied. It's a very small minus, let's see what it is, -8 for the temperature and +1 for the tint. Alright, and again, if we think we went a little bit too far with it, you can always just tweak these numbers. I can take this -8 and bring it back just a little bit. That's back to 0, a little too far. In fact, Let me just type in the number. And I'm going to make it -4. Alright, and for my tint, did I want it to go more green? I don't think so. I think I liked it at 0 for that setting, so I'm going to leave it at 0. Okay. So if I back this up to before we did the white balance correction, that's where we were, and that's where we are. Not much of a change. Okay, next step here is to try to intensify the colors a bit. Let's look at our exposures. We can see from the histogram that if I turn on my warnings, that I really don't have any areas that are blown out. In terms of highlights, I don't have any blacks that are blocking up. We're not in bad shape. If we want to, we can come down and adjust the settings here. Exposure is sort of your overall exposure for the picture now. It used to refer more to the highlights, but now it's sort of the overall brightness of the picture. So if we want, we could bring that up just a touch to increase the exposure. Make it a little bit brighter on the building. Alright, contrast. Again, we can make the scene more contrasty, which I don't like in this case. We can make it less contrasty. I don't like that in this case either. So if I double click on contrast, it resets that back to the 0 setting. In terms of the highlights, if we move the slider up, you see now we do start to blow out some of the whites, as indicated by the little red marks on the roof of the building. Okay. And I can lower those highlights by going to the negative side with highlights. I'm trying to bring out a little definition in the clouds. Alright, shadows, if I go in the negative direction, it darkens the shadows. If I go in the positive direction, it opens up the shadows a little bit. And actually, we have a lot more range to play with the shadows than we did in the earlier versions of Lightroom. Okay. You could separately set a white point and a black point. I'm not going to adjust the white point in this case. The black, if I again increase it, it weakens the blacks. If I decrease it, it gives us a blacker black. And you can see if I go too far, you see the blue building up at the base of the building and the windows of the building. And we don't want to go to a total black there, but pretty close. So right about there. All right. Now didn't want to do the overall contrast because it was too dramatic for the scene, but I can increase the clarity of the scene, which does a local contrast enhancement. And again, see, as you do that, it also affects the other sliders to some extent. But I want to punch up the image a bit and make it a little more definition. So I'm going to fine tune the black to just make sure I'm not blocking up the blacks completely. Alright. In terms of color, vibrance, we'll make our skies bluer, make our grass greener. Alright. Unfortunately, makes our yellows yellower, so it's not bad for most of the building, but I don't exactly like the fact that the building is picking up a yellow cast down here again. So to remove that, I'm going to go down into the HSL panel, and I can come down here to saturation, and if I click on the little adjust saturation by dragging button, go into my image. If I click and drag down, it's going to decrease the saturation of whatever colors it sees at the point where I clicked. Okay. Now it also does this throughout the entire image. So if I pull it all the way down, you can see what it's doing is it's moving over on the right side. It's moved the yellow slider and the orange slider to very negative numbers. All right. I go positive, it moves them positively. I don't want to go that far, obviously. I want to just basically take out the yellow on the side of the building. So about there takes it out. Okay. Now the grass also has a yellow component to it, particularly light grass. So you see if I click on the grass and drag up, alright, well actually in this case it's doing pretty much just green. Usually it does have a yellow component to it which would come back. Let's try a different setting. Yeah, you see it's moved the yellow just a little bit when I do that. Okay. And if I want to make the blues a little more dramatic, come up into the blue sky, click, drag up. Okay, and that's increasing the aquas and the blues in the picture. And I kind of like adjusting the blues, but I don't like adjusting the aquas quite that much, so I'm going to fine tune that a little bit. Alright, so we get to a picture that looks a little more pleasing than where we started. Click on our adjustment brush again if you like, so that it doesn't affect the image. Now you'll notice I do have here some noise reduction being applied, and I apply that through a preset based on the ISO setting I shoot with my particular camera. I know how noisy the sensor is at each ISO setting, so I've worked that out ahead of time basically. Okay, and then the amount of sharpening I do sort of compensates for the blur that I put in with the by doing the noise reduction. Noise reduction always causes some blur. Okay, so we have the image here. I'm pretty happy with it. The only thing it probably needs is a little cleaning up if there's dust spots or anything. If I go in tight here, this doesn't look too bad actually on this particular one. But a lot of these images, since these are slide copies, you see there's some little spots up in the sky. I could use the spot healing brush in Lightroom because there's not very many of these, but I find it easier, particularly if I have a lot of them, to take the image into Photoshop and clean it up a little bit in Photoshop. The other thing I want to do is, this was a JPEG to start with, and to keep it as a JPEG I want to export it as a JPEG, not as a PSD or a TIFF. I want to export it, take it into Lightroom, into Photoshop, do the little touch-ups, particularly with the healing brush, and then save the image out of Photoshop, and then come back into Lightroom and stack it on top of the original image here. So to do all that, I have a preset set up. So all I have to do is right click, go to export, come over here to Dick, add a P. I add the letter P to the file name so I know that I processed the image. Alright, and I can open it up either in CS5 or CS6. This is the beta of CS6, so I think it's still good for a few more days. So let me tell it to do that. Now on the way out, you see what it's doing is it's making a copy of this image, applying these settings. So I'm exporting out the image, and I'm once I've got it exported out as a separate JPEG image with the letter P in the file name, it adds that image back into Lightroom. So what it did is the first step. Now it's opening up CS6, actually the beta version of CS6, and it'll allow me to touch up the image here. And I'm going to get probably a message about CS6 expiring in a second or two. There it comes. Alright, and we're clearly running out of time. I think I've got about a week left on the ability to run CS6. Okay, so double click on the hand tool to make it bigger. Take a look at the image. Like I said, I want to clean up some things. Usually I make a copy of the background layer, just so I'm not, in case I screw things up bad, I can just throw it away quickly. I'm going to blow up the image. And you see there's a few little spots here and there. I'm going to get the spot healing brush, which, okay, now has content aware as one of its options. I'm going to tell it to sample all layers. Alright, and I'm just going to click on the little spots to hopefully make them go away. And if they don't go away cleanly, it's usually the matter is your brush is too big. If you want to use a hard brush and you want to use a small hard brush, the brush should be just a little bit bigger than the fault you're trying to correct. Otherwise it tends to bring in too much material and you'll get blurring edges, or it'll take on kind of a fake look to it. What I usually do here is, you see, I start in the top left corner. I get one screen's worth of material here. I fix everything that I can see within that area. Hold down the hand tool, hold down the space bar to get the hand tool. Slide the image across. Okay, clean up a few more spots. Okay, we'll take that one out. And there's a couple of spots in the tree, and a couple more. Alright, then what I do is I move the cursor down to the bottom of the visible area. Hold down the space bar to get the hand tool, click and drag it up, and then drag it across, and again continue. So I'm sort of sweeping across the image, cleaning up spots along the way. That's the idea. And you can be obsessive about this. You could take hours to get every damn little spot, but most of these spots don't show, particularly if you're just projecting the image or making a relatively small print. Okay, now so you got a little funny color going on here, which I don't particularly like. I can clean that up. Yeah, take out a little bit of the excess yellow by doing that. There's a and most of the spots that you notice are in the sky. But this came from copying a slide, which has been hanging in a drawer, in the slide pages in a drawer for quite a few years. These are pretty dirty slides. And a little bit, see, I didn't get a great crop right there when I did the initial crop. Okay. And the content aware is remarkably good at blending in background for these little areas. Okay. So, alright, so I've done that. We've already applied clarity to this, but one of the things I like to look at is just to see what local contrast enhancement would do. Technically, that's the same thing as clarity, but we applied to clarity before we, did some of our final adjustments. So as a last step here, I like to do local contrast enhancement, and I have an action that does that for me up here, and it runs it automatically. And what it does basically is it selects it makes a copy of the summary of the layers below it, and once it's made that copy, it applies unsharp mask to it with settings of about 25% for the amount and 50 pixels for the radius instead of our normal unsharp mask settings. Now that comes in, and it usually comes in a little too strong. So if I turn the eye on and off and you watch the picture, you can see that it's adding a little bit of punch to the picture. In this case, not bad, just the way it is. In a lot of cases, I'll drop the opacity of that upper layer down to about 50%. And that gives me just a little bit of a kick, but doesn't make it very noticeable. In this case, I can get by with a higher setting, so I'm actually going to leave it at 100%. Okay? If I'm happy with what I've done at this point, I can flatten the layers, because I am going to save this as a JPEG eventually. Alright, now, One last thing I would do is, if you look at my sky, you see that there's some grain still in the sky. And you see, if you get really finicky about it, you can get your adjustment brush out. Yeah, sorry, your spot healing brush out and clean it up a little. But you know, these were shot from a small sensor camera, and this is not so much electronic noise as it's really a grain pattern, because again, these were color slides that have been copied, and back in film days we actually had film grain that showed up in the pictures. Okay, so how do you get rid of that? Well, one of the things I'll do routinely now, again, I'd like to make a copy of the background layer to work on in case I really screw it up. They have some very nice controls now in CS5 and CS6. They've actually been in CS in all the versions of Photoshop for a long time, but they actually work now. One is the blur tool. So if you choose the blur tool with a soft brush and about 50% for the strength, and adjust your brush size a little. Now what I want to do is I want to blur the sky, but I don't want to blur all the detail. So I'm just going to do the bulk parts of the sky. Okay. And try to avoid the buildings as best I can. And I'm just trying to break up that pattern a little bit. Let's see how successful we were. See, that's the before, that's the after. So I do it in the sky area because, you know, in the sky it doesn't really, clouds don't need to be sharp ever. All right. Now, if you also want to do a little bit of final sharpening down here, again, we could run on Sharp Mask with its normal settings, which are like, you know, 100 for the radius and maybe 0.7 to 1.1 for the, I'm sorry, 0.7 to 1.1 for the radius and 100 for the amount. However, in this case, again, this sharpen tool works very well. So there's a blur tool and there's a sharpen tool. And again, 50% strength. And if all you do is get yourself a decent size soft brush and just do a pass over the areas you'd like to sharpen a little bit. Okay, and let that apply. And let's see if we can see a difference. Now it takes a while, by the way, to do the application because you're moving a lot of pixels, even with a fast computer. There we go. And let me blow it up a bit. Look at an area with some detail and see if we can see the difference. So that's the before, that's the after. You look at under tree, you'll see it show up reasonably well on the tree. Okay, before, after. Alright. Again, just trying to add a little bit of punch to the scene. So, once I'm happy with that, I'll flatten the image. Now, the interesting thing is, I've made changes outside of Lightroom. I mean, I made some changes in Lightroom, and I basically, when I ran the export command, it took all the changes that I made within Lightroom and it applied it to the image, and it exported it as a new image that contained all those changes baked in. Okay, so now I've opened that image, the baked-in image now in Photoshop. I've made some more additional changes to it. I want to go back to Lightroom. And the way you go back to Lightroom here is you just do a file save. Not a file save as, just a file save. Okay, and save it as a high resolution JPEG. Alright, and at this point I can close it here. I can go back over to Lightroom. And when I come into Lightroom and take a look at it, what I see is this was the original image. See, it doesn't have the P, but I made a bunch of changes to it. So this is the original JPEG with the Lightroom changes listed, but not baked in and applied. So those changes are still reversible at this stage. And the image right next to it is the image that I exported as a new JPEG and baked in the changes. I took this image into Photoshop made additional changes. And if you look carefully down at the bottom here, there's a little exclamation point in the corner. It says Error Writing Metadata. And if you click on it, it gives you a window that says the metadata for this photo has been changed by both Lightroom and another application, in this case, Photoshop. Should Lightroom import settings from disk or overwrite the disk settings with those from this catalog? Well, right now the image in the catalog is the image that I exported but before I made the additional changes in Photoshop. What's on the disk at the moment, because I did the file save command, is the exported image with the additional changes I made in Photoshop. So what I want to do here is I want to say import the settings from the disk, and that'll update the Lightroom catalog with the latest version that I have that came out of the corrections in Photoshop. Okay, so I click. All right, so now let's bake these changes in. All right. And now you notice I have the two images down here. And what it does is, the way I set this up initially when I did this export is I have it stack the two images. Now that's showing them as two separate images, but they're actually part of a stack. So if I right click on the image, go up to where it says stacking and say collapse the stack. Alright, what happens now when you look down below, let me get out of that. Okay, when you look down below, what you see is it's only showing one of the images. It's only showing the top image, and the top image is the final copy, the version that has the P on it to indicate it's been fully processed. Right? The other original image with its Lightroom changes is underneath it, but it just doesn't show it up on the list and take up space, although it's still there. Okay? So that's sort of the way I use the develop mode in Lightroom, and I touch up things in Photoshop.